All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back for another deep dive.
Glad to be back.
So this one, we've been getting a lot of requests from you guys, the college students out there, the future LPNs,
Right.
um, hitting the books, prepping for those big exams. And a topic that kept coming up was this whole world of cultural influences on nutrition, ethnic influences, religious influences, really, how all of that ties into patient care.
It's a huge topic. And I mean, it makes sense that they'd be asking about it.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about it, as a future LPN, you're going to be working with people from all walks of life.
All different backgrounds, yeah.
And each person brings their own, beliefs and practices about food to the table.
Absolutely. And to be honest, when I was in nursing school, this wasn't something we went super deep on, but it's clearly so important.
Yeah, and it's not just about, knowing what foods different cultures eat. I mean, that's part of it, but it's really about understanding how those beliefs, those cultural beliefs affect things like, a patient's willingness to follow dietary recommendations.
Exactly. So that's what we're going to unpack today, all the need to know info from your nursing nutrition materials. Consider this your cheat sheet to understanding this whole intricate world.
Yeah, we want to give you those aha moments, those key insights that'll not only help you ace those exams, but actually make you a better, more culturally competent nurse down the road.
Exactly. So let's get right to it. First things first, why is understanding these cultural, ethnic, and religious influences on nutrition so crucial for nurses?
All right, so, I mean, the simple answer is it's all about patient-centered care. Right. It's recognizing that food is not just about, calories and vitamins and minerals. I mean, it goes way deeper than that.
Yeah.
It's really about a person's identity, their heritage, their sense of belonging.
Their comfort.
Exactly. And when we understand that, it helps us avoid falling into this trap of what we call ethnocentrism.
Yeah.
And that's basically when you see your own culture's beliefs and practices as the right way.
A default. Yeah.
Exactly. And that can really get in the way of providing good care. Because you might unintentionally, disrespect someone's preferences or dismiss their concerns.
Yeah.
And when that happens, patients are less likely to trust you. They're less likely to follow your advice.
Makes sense.
And in the end, that impacts their health.
Okay, so really seeing the whole picture, seeing the person behind the patient, right?
Exactly.
But speaking of that, our material mentions this idea of a foodway. What exactly does that tell us about a client?
Okay, so foodway, it's kind of like this big umbrella term, right?
Okay.
It encompasses everything about a person's relationship with food. So yeah, it includes the actual foods they eat, but it also looks at things like the role of food in their culture.
Mm-hmm.
Are certain foods reserved for special occasions?
Yeah. Right.
It includes how they get their food, how they prepare it. Like, are there specific cooking methods or seasonings that are really important to them?
Yeah.
And even what they consider edible in the first place, you'd be surprised how much that varies across cultures.
Oh, I bet.
And then, Foodway also looks at the timing of meals. Like, when do they eat? How often do they eat? And then, really importantly, how they perceive food to impact their health.
So it's way more than just a list of ingredients, right?
Yeah, it's like a cultural map of their relationship with food.
That's really interesting. Now, our sources talk about categorizing foods as core, secondary, and peripheral. Can you sort of break down what each of those means and tell us why that matters, especially, for someone prepping for their LPN exam?
Absolutely. So this is a really practical concept to keep in mind, especially when you're thinking about, helping patients make dietary changes. So core foods, these are the staples, right?
Okay.
These are the foods that are eaten, pretty much every day. They're the foundation of a person's diet. Think, rice in a lot of Asian cultures, or corn and beans in, many Latin American cultures.
And a backbone.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have your secondary foods. These are eaten frequently, but not necessarily every day. It might be certain types of vegetables, certain proteins, things like that.
Okay.
And then you have the peripheral foods. These are the ones that are eaten, occasionally, maybe for special occasions or when they're available, or, maybe a person just doesn't like them as much.
Okay, makes sense.
So why does all this matter? Well, imagine you're working with a patient who needs to make some dietary changes for their health.
Right.
Now, if you try to get them to eliminate a core food, like, it's going to be a lot harder, right? It's a huge part of their culture, their daily life, their family traditions, maybe.
Right.
But if you can focus on making changes to the peripheral foods, maybe swapping out a less healthy option for a healthier one that's still culturally appropriate, you're going to have a much better chance of success.
Right. Meet them where they are.
Exactly.
So, okay, Culture shapes what we eat. That makes sense. But it also shapes the how and the when, right?
You got it. I mean, think about the actual preparation of food.
Right.
I mean, different cultures have all sorts of unique ways of, obtaining ingredients, preparing them, cooking them, seasoning them. Some cultures, they rely heavily on fresh local ingredients. Others, might use a lot of preserved or processed foods.
Right, right.
And then, even things like the equipment they use, whether it's a wok or a clay oven or a slow cooker, all of that plays into their food culture.
And that matters for us as nurses, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, imagine you're working with a patient who's used to cooking everything in a certain way, and then you give them a meal plan that requires them to use, equipment they don't have or techniques they're not familiar with.
Not going to work?
Yeah, it sets them up for failure.
Okay. And what about the timing of meals?
Yeah, that's another big one. I mean, you have some cultures where it's totally normal to have a big meal in the middle of the day and then a lighter meal in the evening.
Okay.
And then you have others where it's the opposite. And then, some cultures have, lots of little snacks throughout the day while others stick to 3 square meals. And as a nurse, you need to be aware of these patterns because it might affect when you give medications, if they need to be taken with food.
Right.
Or if a patient's fasting for religious reasons, you need to know that so you don't accidentally disrupt their practices.
Yeah, makes total sense. So, okay, we've talked about what we eat, how we prepare it, when we eat. What about the beliefs surrounding food? Because I know that different cultures have really different ideas about what's healthy and what's not.
Absolutely. And this is where it gets really interesting. In American culture, we tend to focus a lot on, food groups like eat your fruits and vegetables, get enough protein, limit your saturated fat.
Right. That's what we're taught.
Exactly. But other cultures might have completely different systems for understanding how food affects health.
Okay. And what are some examples?
Well, a really common one, especially in many Asian and Pacific Islander cultures, is this idea of hot and cold balance.
Right. I've heard of that. But it doesn't literally mean hot and cold, right?
It's not about temperature. It's more about the perceived effects of foods on the body.
Yeah.
So, certain foods are seen as having heating properties and others are seen as cooling.
Okay.
And the goal is to maintain a balance between these two forces. Like if someone has a fever, which is considered a hot condition, they might be given cooling foods to help bring their body back into balance.
So it's about restoring harmony, kind of.
Exactly. And these beliefs, they can really influence what people choose to eat and when they choose to eat it.
So important for us to understand as nurses. Now, what happens when someone moves to a new cultural environment? Because we talk about acculturation in our material.
Right. So acculturation, it's basically the process of adapting to a new culture. And when it comes to food, it can get really complex. Well, first-generation immigrants, they often hold on pretty tightly to their traditional food ways.
Makes sense.
But as their kids grow up, second generation, third generation, they start to get more exposed to the dominant culture's food practices.
They start to blend, kind of.
Exactly. And that can lead to all sorts of changes. They might start eating new foods or substituting traditional ingredients or even cooking things in a different way.
And that can be both good and bad, right?
Exactly. I mean, sometimes acculturation can lead to people eating a wider variety of healthy foods.
Mm-hmm.
They get exposed to new fruits and vegetables they might not have had access to before.
Okay.
But sometimes it can also lead to people eating more processed foods, more fast food, things that are high in fat, sugar, and salt.
So it's a mixed bag.
It is, and it's something we need to be really sensitive to as nurses because we might need to help patients navigate these changes, help them make healthy choices while still respecting their cultural preferences.
And speaking of specific cultures, I think it would be really helpful to talk about some of the key ones that are mentioned in our study materials, the ones that are likely to come up on the LPN exam. So let's start with the Hispanic Latinx community, since it's such a large and growing demographic in the U.S.
Absolutely. And again, it's really important to remember that this is a super diverse group.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about people from all over Latin America,
Yeah.
Mexico, Central America, South America, the Caribbean.
Right.
But that said, there are some common threads when it comes to food. Like we talked about earlier, that hot and cold balance is often a big part of traditional beliefs about food and health.
Okay.
And there are certain foods that are often used for their perceived healing properties, like cinnamon, or herbal teas like mint and chamomile.
I love chamomile tea.
Yeah, me too. Now, in terms of overall dietary patterns, there's a lot to celebrate. I mean, many Hispanic Latinx cultures have a really high intake of fruits, vegetables, and legumes, which is fantastic.
That's great.
Yeah, but there are also some potential areas of concern. The traditional diet can sometimes be high in saturated fat and sodium.
Okay.
And there can be a lower intake of whole grains and milk in some cases. And unfortunately, this community faces a really high prevalence of obesity and type 2 diabetes.
So that's something we really need to be aware of as nurses.
Absolutely. I mean, we need to be, monitoring blood sugar levels, providing education about healthy eating habits, really working with patients to manage these conditions.
Right. Okay. So lots to consider there. What about the Black African American community?
All right. So this is another incredibly diverse group, of course. I mean, we're talking about people whose heritage traces back to all different parts of Africa. And it's really important to remember that their food habits today are shaped by so many factors.
Like what?
Well, where they live, their socioeconomic status, their work schedules, all of that plays a role.
Makes sense.
Now, one interesting thing about this community is that there's often a greater acceptance of a larger body size.
Okay.
Which can sometimes make it, harder to talk about things like weight management.
I see.
And there are, some nutritional concerns to be aware of. I mean, research suggests that this group may have a lower overall intake of some of those key nutrients like whole grains, milk, and vegetables.
Okay.
And they also have the highest prevalence of obesity among all racial and ethnic groups, and higher rates of diabetes, high blood pressure.
And I imagine that those conditions can be especially challenging to manage in this community, given the historical and systemic healthcare disparities they face.
Absolutely. I mean, access to healthcare, access to healthy food, all of that plays a role.
So culturally sensitive care is especially crucial here.
For sure.
Okay, let's talk about the Asian American Pacific Islander community. Now, this is a really broad category, right?
It is. It is. I mean, you're talking about, dozens of different ethnic groups, people from China, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Vietnam, all over the place.
Right, lots of different traditions.
Exactly. But despite that diversity, there are some common themes in their food culture. Like there's a huge emphasis on fresh ingredients, and the preparation of food is often seen as really important, even artistic process.
Okay.
And the diet traditionally is higher in rice and vegetables and lower in meat. And that idea of yin and yang, that balance, is really prominent.
Right. We talked about that earlier.
Exactly. So yin foods are seen as cooling, like seaweed, tofu, a lot of fruits and vegetables.
Yeah.
And yang foods are seen as warming, things like meat, spices, fried foods.
Okay.
And the idea is that you need to balance those two to stay healthy.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, it really is. Now, in terms of health, this group tends to have the lowest rates of obesity and the highest life expectancy.
Wow, that's amazing.
It is. However, they can have higher risk of developing diabetes even at a lower body weight.
So the BMI chart doesn't necessarily tell the whole story.
Exactly. And there's also a potential for higher sodium intake because a lot of traditional cooking methods involve, salting or drying or using a lot of soy sauce.
So important things to keep in mind.
They are.
All right, so we've talked about some broad cultural groups. What about something more specific, like soul food?
Okay, so soul food, I mean, this one has such a rich history, right?
Well,
it really reflects the resilience and creativity of African Americans, during times of incredible hardship. I mean, these dishes, they were born out of necessity, using what was available, often scraps and leftovers.
But they turned into something so much more.
Exactly. I mean, soul food is all about community, about family, about celebrating life, even in the face of adversity. And the food itself, it's flavorful, it's comforting, it's deeply satisfying.
So what are some of those traditional soul food staples?
Oh, man, where do I even begin? I mean, you've got your rice, your grits, your cornbread, your collard greens, your black-eyed peas, your sweet potatoes.
Oh, so good.
And then, on the protein side, you've got your fried chicken, your barbecue ribs, your chitterlings.
Yeah.
And everything is often cooked with, lots of fat, whether it's lard or bacon grease or butter.
Which makes it taste amazing, but...
Yeah, there are some downsides. I mean, soul food, traditionally, it's really high in fat, sodium, cholesterol. And it can be low in fiber, calcium, potassium.
Okay.
And that can contribute to a higher risk of heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, all of those things.
So it's a balancing act. I mean, honoring the tradition and the culture while also being mindful of those health concerns.
Absolutely. And that's where we come in as nurses. We can help patients, maybe make some modifications to those traditional recipes, maybe use less fat, maybe add more vegetables.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the traditional Mexican diet.
All right, so this one, as we touched on earlier, it's a beautiful blend of, indigenous Mesoamerican traditions and Spanish influences.
Okay.
And it's all about fresh ingredients, vibrant flavors, and lots of variety. I mean, you've got your corn, of course, which is the cornerstone, often in the form of tortillas. And then you've got your beans, your rice, your chilies, your avocados, your tomatoes, your cilantro, your limes. It's also fresh and flavorful.
I love Mexican food.
Yeah, me too. And the traditional diet is actually pretty healthy,
Is it?
It is. It's high in fiber, low in saturated fat, and rich in vitamins and minerals.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah. But as with any culture, acculturation can lead to some changes that aren't so great for health.
Like what?
Well, people might start eating fewer vegetables, more processed foods, more red meat, more sugary drinks.
Right, that makes sense.
And those changes, they can increase the risk of, those same chronic diseases we've been talking about.
Heart disease, diabetes, all of that.
Exactly.
So it's about, again, finding that balance.
Exactly.
Okay, let's talk about the traditional Chinese diet now.
Okay, so this is another one with a ton of regional variation. I mean, China's a huge country with a really long and complex culinary history. But in general, the traditional diet emphasizes balance and harmony. And a lot of those same principles of yin and yang apply here.
Okay, so remind us what those are.
So yin foods are seen as cooling and moistening. Things like fruits, vegetables, tofu, fish.
Okay.
And yang foods are seen as warming and drying. Things like meat, spices, fried foods.
Okay, got it.
And the idea is that you need to eat a balance of both to stay healthy.
So it's a holistic approach.
Exactly. Now, the traditional Chinese diet is also really interesting because it uses a lot of unique cooking techniques like stir-frying, steaming, braising.
Yeah.
And it often incorporates medicinal herbs and spices into dishes.
Which is pretty cool.
It is. And the diet overall is typically high in vegetables, low in saturated fat, and rich in antioxidants.
So it's a pretty healthy way of eating.
It is.
Yeah.
But again, as people acculturate, they might start eating more processed foods, more red meat, more sugary drinks, which can have negative health effects.
Right. Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here, but I want to make sure we touch on vegetarian diets as well, since those are becoming more and more common, and they can be influenced by all sorts of factors, cultural, ethical, religious.
Absolutely. And there's so much variety within vegetarianism itself, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, you've got your semi-vegetarians or flexitarians who mostly eat plant-based, but they might occasionally eat meat or fish.
Okay.
And then you've got your vegetarians who don't eat any meat, poultry, or fish, but they might eat eggs or dairy.
Okay.
And then you've got your vegans who don't eat any animal products at all.
Right. No meat, no dairy, no eggs, nothing.
Exactly. And from a nursing perspective, it's really important to understand the nutritional needs of each of these groups.
Especially the vegans, right?
Especially the vegans. I mean, they need to be really careful to get enough protein, iron, calcium, vitamin B12, all of those nutrients that are typically found in animal products.
And what about those other diets, the ones that are kind of on the fringe, like raw veganism or the macrobiotic diet? Do we need to know about those?
I mean, it's always good to have a basic understanding.
Okay.
So raw veganism, that's basically eating only uncooked plant-based foods. And the macrobiotic diet, it's a little more complex, but it emphasizes whole grains, vegetables, and beans.
Okay.
And both of these diets, they can be really healthy if they're done right. But they can also be really restrictive, so it's important to make sure people are getting all the nutrients they need.
Right. Okay. So vegetarianism, lots of different variations, lots of things to consider.
Absolutely.
Okay, now I want to make sure we talk about religion, because that's a huge influence on food choices for so many people.
It is, and it's often even more influential than culture, right?
Oh, so?
Well, religion often transcends national boundaries. You might have people from completely different cultures who share the same religious beliefs about food.
Right.
And those beliefs, they can be really powerful because they're often tied to a person's identity, their sense of community, their connection to something larger than themselves.
Right.
So it's not just about what they eat, it's about the meaning behind the food.
So what are some examples of religions that have specific dietary laws?
Oh, there are so many. I mean,
Yeah.
you've got Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Seventh-day Adventism, Mormonism.
And the rules can be really specific, right?
It can. I mean, some religions have prohibitions against certain foods like pork or shellfish.
Okay.
Some have rules about how animals should be slaughtered.
Right.
Some have fasting practices.
Okay.
And some have guidelines about how food should be prepared, like kosher laws in Judaism.
So as nurses, we really need to be sensitive to all of this.
We do. We need to be aware of the different dietary practices, and we need to be respectful of our patients' beliefs.
Right. So what are some practical things we can do to make sure we're providing culturally and religiously sensitive care?
Well, the most important thing is to ask. Ask your patients about their dietary preferences, their restrictions, their beliefs.
Right.
Don't assume you know.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then, once you know what their needs are, you can start to think about how to accommodate them.
Right.
Maybe that means ordering special meals from the hospital kitchen or helping them find culturally appropriate food in the community.
Okay.
Or maybe it just means being respectful of their fasting schedule or making sure they have a quiet place to pray before meals.
Right. So it's really about going that extra mile to make sure our patients feel seen and heard and respected.
Exactly.
And that can make all the difference in their care.
It really can.
Okay, so we talked a lot about specific cultures and religions, but I also want to make sure we talk about those general principles of cultural sensitivity that apply across the board.
Right. Because at the end of the day, it's all about treating each patient as an individual, right? And recognizing that their cultural background shapes their beliefs and practices around food. So, avoid making assumptions. Ask open-ended questions. Be respectful of their choices.
Okay.
And remember that example from our notes about the nurse who recommended her own favorite foods to a patient.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one.
I mean, that's a classic example of ethnocentrism, right?
Right.
We can't impose our own cultural values on our patients.
Yeah, we're there to support them, not to judge them.
Exactly.
All right, so I think we've covered a lot of ground here, and this is all information that's really relevant for the LPN exam, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is stuff that's going to come up in your coursework, in your clinical rotations, and definitely on the NCLEX.
Okay, so for our listeners out there who are studying for their LPN exam, what's the one big takeaway they should remember about cultural influences on nutrition?
I mean, the bottom line is that understanding and respecting these influences is essential for providing good care.
Right.
It's not just about knowing what people eat. It's about understanding why they eat what they eat and how those choices impact their health.
Exactly.
And when you have that understanding, you can build stronger relationships with your patients, you can provide more effective care, and you can really make a difference in their lives.
And as a future LPN, that's what it's all about, right?
Oh, it really is.
Okay, so on that note, here's a final thought to chew on. How might understanding a patient's food traditions help you not only improve their physical health, but also build trust and rapport, which we know is so crucial for positive patient outcomes?
That's a great question.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone.
And good luck with your studies.
We'll catch you next time.